Hey guys, tonight we embark on a rather peculiar journey, not to a land of mythical beasts or epic battles, but into the heart of a nation obsessed. A people caught in the beautiful, fragile grip of a flower. Picture yourself, if you will, stepping off a creaking merchant ship, the salty temps of the North Sea still clinging to your clothes. You're in the Dutch Republic, early 17th century. Canals glitter like ribbons unfurled between tall, gabled houses, and the air, well, it's a heady mix of exotic spices, damp earth, and perhaps a whiff of something a fishmonger wishes he'd sold yesterday. It's a time of incredible wealth and discovery, an era they call the Golden Age. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It truly helps the channel find other curious minds like yours. And as always, I'd love to see where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below. Let's be honest, you probably wouldn't last a week here without your smartphone and reliable Wi-Fi, Golden Age charm notwithstanding. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a bustling quay in Amsterdam, or perhaps it's Harlem, the air thick with the chatter of a dozen languages. Dutch, of course, predominates, but your ears also pick up the clipped tones of English traders, the melodic lilt of French Huguenots seeking refuge, and the guttural German of merchants from the Hanseatic cities. The sheer energy of the place is palpable. This isn't some sleepy backwater. This is the thrumming heart of a global trade empire. The Dutch Golden Age, a period stretching roughly through the 17th century, saw the newly independent Dutch Republic rise to become a dominant force in global trade, science, and art. You'd see ships of the Dutch East India Company, the famous VOC, their sails billowing as they arrive laden with silks from Persia, spices from the Moluccas, and porcelain from distant China. Imagine the stories those sailors could tell of treacherous seas and lands, so different they might as well be other planets. The streets themselves are a testament to this newfound prosperity. You weave your way past warehouses stacked high with goods, their cranes silhouetted against the often grey sky. The houses, though narrow, a result of being taxed by their canal frontage. A clever bit of early urban planning, if you ask me, are scrubbed clean, their windows gleaming. Inside, if you could peek, you'd find rooms filled with sturdy, dark furniture. Maps adorning the walls, a sign of their global reach, and a bit of a humble brag. And perhaps a painting or two by a promising young artist named Rembrandt or Vermeer, though they wouldn't be old masters just yet. Life here is driven by commerce, by innovation. Windmills, those iconic symbols of the Netherlands, aren't just picturesque. They're industrial powerhouses, draining polders to reclaim land from the sea and powering everything from sawmills to paper factories. There's a certain pragmatism to the Dutch character you observe, a nonsense approach to life, yet also a burgeoning appreciation for beauty and the finer things. A dangerous combination, as we'll soon discover. They've even mastered the art of making herring taste, well, like herring, but in about 50 different ways. A true culinary feat. If you're into that sort of thing, into this world of hard-won success and burgeoning luxury, a newcomer arrives. It's not a conquering hero or a revolutionary invention, not at first, anyway. It's a flower, the tulip. Native to the mountainous regions of Central Asia, it had journeyed west, captivating the sultans of the Ottoman Empire with its intense colors and elegant form. You can imagine it, a splash of vibrant crimson or a deep, velvety purple, unlike anything commonly seen in European gardens, which were mostly filled with more subdued native blooms. Its arrival in the Netherlands is often credited to Carolus Clusius, a renowned botanist who, in the late 16th century, established an important botanical garden at Leiden University. He received some tulip bulbs from Ogier Ghiselin de Busbeck, an ambassador to the Ottoman court, and began to cultivate them. Clusius was a scholar, interested in the tulip for its botanical properties, its variations, and its exotic allure. He wasn't trying to start a financial revolution. He was just a man who really liked plants. Initially, these tulips were collector's items for the wealthy, elite, and ardent horticulturists. They were rare, difficult to propagate quickly, and a symbol of one's worldliness and connection to distant, exotic lands. Imagine having something in your modest Dutch garden that a sultan might also admire. It was the 17th century equivalent of having the latest, unobtainable gadget, only far more beautiful and, crucially, alive. There's a rather famous, though perhaps embellished, story that illustrates the tulip's initial unfamiliarity. Historians still argue whether the famous tale of a sailor, having been rewarded for his work with what he thought was an onion, actually sat down and ate a priceless Semper Augustus tulip bulb with his herring is entirely factual or a later embellishment to emphasize the madness to come. If it is true, that must have been one very expensive and likely quite disappointing lunch. You can just picture him munching away, wondering why this particular onion was so underwhelming, while its owner was probably having a full-blown meltdown somewhere nearby. It does make you wonder what other exotic vegetables were accidentally consumed by hungry, unsuspecting dock workers. Probably best not to dwell on it. For now, the tulip is simply a beautiful, intriguing flower, its petals holding no hint of the storm they are about to unleash upon your new Dutch acquaintances. Its journey from the Sultan's garden to the scholar's plot is complete, but its journey into the heart of Dutch society, into its very homes and dreams, is just beginning. So, there you are, amidst the hustle and pragmatic energy of the Dutch Golden Age. And this exotic bloom, the tulip, has made its quiet, yet captivating, entrance. Remember our friend, Carolus Clusius, the botanist meticulously tending his bulbs in Leiden? Well, the thing about truly beautiful and rare objects is that they rarely stay confined to academic circles for long, especially not in a society brimming with new wealth and an eagerness to show it off. You begin to notice a shift. The tulip, once a curiosity for scholars and a prized possession of a few well-connected individuals, starts to appear in the meticulously kept gardens of the affluent merchant class. These aren't just any gardens, mind you. We're talking about elegant, ordered spaces behind those tall, respectable gabled houses, little havens of green where the hustle of the port cities momentarily fades. And it's here, in these private Edens, that the tulip truly begins its transformation into the ultimate luxury item. The Dutch elite, those successful burghers who made their fortunes trading everything from timber to spices, were keenly aware of status. In a society that, at least outwardly, valued sobriety and hard work, displays of wealth had to be somewhat nuanced. You couldn't just parade around dripping in gold like some flamboyant Italian prince. That wasn't the Dutch way, but a rare painting, a meticulously crafted cabinet filled with Chinese porcelain, or, even better, a collection of tulips, their petals painted with colors so intense they seemed to glow. Now that was a statement. This was how Uncharted Domesticity began to unfold. with the home and its adjoining garden becoming a primary stage for showcasing one's taste, connections, and of course, financial standing. You'd see rows of these prized flowers, perhaps protected by small, ornate fences, little velvet ropes for the floral VIPs. Imagine being invited to such a home. The host, with a carefully casual air, would lead you through to the garden, and there they would be, the tulips, standing proud and aloof, each bloom a tiny, perfect jewel. The conversation would hush, and you'd feel the unspoken weight of their value, the sheer exclusivity of it all. It's a long way from that poor sailor supposedly mistaking a bulb for an onion, isn't it? Now, people are practically bowing to them. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Dutch elite during the Golden Age were voracious collectors. Art, scientific instruments, exotic shells, maps, anything that bespoke education, worldliness, and wealth was fair game. Tulips slotted into this collecting craze perfectly. They were beautiful, they were exotic, and, crucially, they were rare. And what drives the value of any collectible? Scarcity. Certain types of tulips, especially those with broken colors, feathered or flamed patterns on their petals, became extraordinarily sought after. What these early enthusiasts didn't know was that these beautiful breaks were actually symptoms of a virus, the tulip-breaking virus, which, while creating stunning patterns, also weakened the bulb over time. But in their ignorance, they just saw unique beauty, a happy accident of nature that made a specific bulb one of a kind. You can almost picture the hushed excitement of a connoisseur unveiling a new break, a pattern no one has ever seen before. It's like owning a unique piece of art, but one that you grew yourself, or, more likely, paid a hefty sum to a skilled gardener to grow for you. Some of these keen collectors even went to the lengths of commissioning tulip books meticulously, hand-painted albums showcasing their prized blooms, each illustration a testament to their floral wealth. These weren't just records. They were status symbols in themselves, the 17th century equivalent of a carefully curated Instagram feed, flaunting your hashtag tulip goals for all your rivals. I mean, friends, to admire. One can only imagine the pressure. To have the rarest bloom, the most unique pattern. It's enough to make a modern-day plant parent, stressed about their fiddly fig, feel a sense of historical camaraderie. This passion wasn't just about quiet appreciation in a secluded garden. Oh no. The desire for these floral treasures, these petals of prestige, began to create ripples throughout Dutch society. You see, the thing about status symbols is that they inspire aspiration. When the very wealthy flaunt their prized possessions, those slightly less wealthy, and then those aspiring to be wealthy, start to take notice. They see the admiration in the eyes of visitors, hear the whispered conversations about who owns the most magnificent Semper Augustus or Viceroy tulip, and a little thought begins to plant itself. Perhaps I, too, could own such a treasure. Perhaps I could cultivate a bit of that prestige. Historians still argue whether the initial drive for tulip collection among the elite was purely aesthetic. Passion, a genuine love for the flower's beauty, or if early signs of speculative interest, a nascent understanding that these bulbs could be more than just garden ornaments, were present from the very beginning. It's a subtle shift, like the first blush of color on an unopened bud, but you start to sense it in the air. The conversations in polite society might still revolve around art, theology, or the latest news from the VOC, but increasingly, tulips find their way in. Did you hear about Peter's new bulb? Cost him a carriage and 2 horses, they say. Suddenly, The herring trade seems a tad mundane when compared to the vibrant drama unfolding in the flower beds. The idea of financial dreams tied to these flowers is just beginning to germinate. For now, it's mostly confined to the upper echelons, but the seeds of a wider fascination are being sown. It's like watching a trend take hold. First the celebrities, then the influencers, then suddenly everyone wants one. You might even find yourself a curious observer in this unfolding drama, trying to impress a guest with your own modest collection of common garden tulips, only for them to politely admire them before their gaze drifts to your neighbor's plot, where a single, impossibly vibrant bloom stands like a floral monarch, effortlessly outshining your humble efforts. It's a gentle kind of social warfare, waged with petals and pollen. The tulip is no longer just a plant. It's a conversation piece, a status marker, and, for a select few, an increasingly valuable asset. The stage is being meticulously set, the soil carefully prepared for something much bigger, much more frenetic than anyone could yet imagine. The quiet gardens of the wealthy are about to become the unlikely epicenter of an economic phenomenon. You're finding yourself drawn deeper into this curious Dutch obsession, watching as these tulips transition from mere garden ornaments to potent symbols of prestige. It's not just any tulip that causes the pulse of a wealthy merchant to quicken. Though, oh no, there's a particular magic at play. A beautiful anomaly that transforms an already lovely flower into an object of fervent desire. You start to hear whispers, then more excited chatter about broken tulips. Now, this doesn't mean someone's clumsily snapped a stem, perish the thought, especially if it's a prized specimen. Broken refers to the spectacular way. Their colors sometimes fracture and streak, creating intricate patterns that were utterly captivating and, crucially, unpredictable. Imagine a deep purple tulip, elegant in its own right, suddenly blooming with delicate white feathers licking up its petals, or a rich crimson one streaked with veins of gold or creamy yellow. These were the bazaars, with their yellow or cream backgrounds and red, brown, or purple streaks. The biblomens, sporting white backgrounds with violet or purple markings. And the roses, with their white grounds and delicate rose, pink, or crimson flares. Compared to their solid-colored brethren, the selfs, these broken bulbs were like living, breathing works of art, each one a unique masterpiece painted by an unseen hand. The sensory allure is undeniable. You might find yourself leaning in close, examining the impossibly fine lines, the way the colors bleed and contrast, almost as if a miniaturist had painstakingly detailed each petal. And the most fascinating part, no one at the time truly understood why this happened. The mainstream historical fact is that the cause of these beautiful breaks, the tulip-breaking virus, also known as a mosaic virus, spread by aphids wouldn't be identified until the early 20th century. So, back in your 17th century Dutch setting, these transformations were seen as a delightful, almost mystical, quirk of nature. Growers, desperate to replicate these effects or induce them in plain bulbs, tried all sorts of methods. You can just picture them earnestly painting their bulbs with different pigments, burying them in specific types of soil, or perhaps even, as a joke might have it, whispering encouraging sonnets to them by moonlight, hoping to coax out those coveted flames and feathers. "Come on, little bulb," you can almost hear them murmur, "show me some of that viral magic." Whatever that is. Of course, none of these folk remedies actually worked, because the virus was the true artist, and a rather fickle one at that. This unpredictability and the inherent weakness of the infected bulbs for the virus while creating beauty, also made the bulbs less vigorous, and their offsets fewer and slower to mature, only added to their rarity and consequently their value. It's a strange irony, isn't it? A diseased plant becoming the pinnacle of desirability. The most famous of these broken varieties, names that would be uttered with a kind of reverence, like Semper Augustus or Viceroy, became the stuff of legend. Semper Augustus, for instance, was renowned for its deep carmine streaks on a flawless white background, a pattern so exquisite that only a handful of bulbs were known to exist. Owning one was like possessing the rarest diamond. These weren't just flowers. They were horticultural celebrities, their likenesses captured in those prized tulip books we talked about, each illustration a testament to its owner's discerning eye and deep pockets. One quirky tidbit from the era is the sheer detail lavished on these botanical illustrations, which often included not just the bloom but also the bulb, sometimes even a cross-section, elevating the entire plant to an object of scientific and aesthetic veneration. They were the supermodels of the plant world, and everyone wanted their portrait. The allure of this viral artistry wasn't just about beauty, it was about uniqueness. Because the breaking was so unpredictable, each resulting bloom was essentially one of a kind. Even offsets from a broken bulb might show variations in their patterns. This fed directly into those burgeoning financial dreams you're starting to sense all around you. To own a uniquely patterned tulip was to own something no one else in the world possessed. It was the ultimate exclusive. Historians still argue whether the top prices recorded for the most famous broken varieties, those figures that make your eyes water even centuries later, were for a single, perfect bulb, or perhaps for a small lot, including the main bulb and a few of its precious, slow-growing offsets. Record-keeping, especially in the heat of a speculative frenzy, wasn't always as meticulous as one might hope. It's a bit like trying to figure out the true value of a modern art piece based on auction whispers. The mystique is part of the price. You can almost feel the excitement, the gamble inherent in it all. A grower might plant a bed of seemingly ordinary bulbs, and then, come spring, one or two might break spectacularly, transforming overnight from modest potential to a small fortune. It's like buying a lottery ticket that you have to patiently tend for months or even years. Imagine the modern equivalent, chasing after ultra-rare collectible sneakers or a limited edition graphic card. There's that same thrill of the hunt, the same desire for the unique variant, but with tulips. You had the added bonus that your investment might, just decide not to come up next year or get eaten by a mouse. It certainly added a frisson of risk to the whole endeavor. You can picture the scene. One merchant smugly displaying his newly broken Admiral van der Eyck, while his friend sighs dramatically over his stubbornly plain Goudas, which, despite all his hopeful mutterings and experimental soil concoctions, remains resolutely, disappointingly, yellow. There's a gentle tragedy in it, the kind of quiet frustration that only a gardener who's been outsmarted by a plant can truly understand. And it's this very specific, virally induced, and utterly unpredictable beauty that is now fanning the flames, turning a horticultural hobby into something far more volatile, far more thrilling, and potentially far more dangerous. The captivating allure of those broken tulips, those viral wonders we just talked about, is now firmly taking root in the Dutch imagination. But what happens when an obsession this potent, this glitteringly attractive, can no longer be contained within the manicured hedges of high society or the hushed rooms of wealthy connoisseurs? Well, you're about to see it spill out, like an overturned ale cask, into the more, shall we say, democratic spaces of Dutch life. You'll notice that the serious discussions about bulb weights, color patterns, and potential offspring, once confined to those elegant drawing rooms or specialized botanical circles, are now echoing in places with a distinctly different aroma. Less rosewater and beeswax, more pipe tobacco, stale beer, and fried fish. Yes, my friend, we are heading into the heart of the Dutch tavern. Picture yourself pushing open a heavy wooden door, stepping out of the crisp canal air and into a room thick with smoke, noise, and the fug of communal conviviality. The light is dim, perhaps from a few sputtering tallow candles and the orange glow of a peat fire in the hearth. The floor is lightly sawdust strewn, and the air vibrates with boisterous laughter, heated arguments, and the clinking of tankards. This is a far cry from the serene gardens where you first encountered those prized blooms, isn't it? Yet, it's in these smoky back rooms, amidst the everyday clamor of artisans, shopkeepers, sailors, and even farmers, that the tulip trade is about to undergo a radical transformation. The conversation, once dominated by Latin botanical names and nuanced discussions of lineage, now buzzes with a simpler, more urgent question. What's it worth, and how quickly can it make me rich? This is where the mainstream historical fact comes into play. The Tulipomania craze, particularly as it neared its peak, wasn't just a game for the rich. It drew in a remarkably broad spectrum of society. Suddenly, your local baker isn't just talking about the price of rye. He's got an opinion on the going rate for a Semper Augustus offset. You'll see weavers who, just months ago, were solely focused on the intricate patterns of their tapestries, now poring over crude drawings of tulips. Their eyes are light with a different kind of speculative gleam. Chimney sweeps, their faces still smudged with soot, might be pooling their meager earnings to buy a share in a single, promising bulb. It's a testament to the intoxicating power of these financial dreams. The tulip offered a tantalizing glimpse of a shortcut, a way to leapfrog the traditional paths to modest prosperity. Why toil for years at a loom or forge when a single fortunate trade in a flower bulb could potentially secure your family's future, buy you a bigger house, or even elevate your social standing? You'll overhear a conversation where a burly blacksmith, a man whose calloused hands are far more accustomed to shaping stubborn iron, is passionately debating the subtle merits of a Bizarden versus a Bibleman, with all the earnest conviction of a lifelong horticulturist. It's both comical and a little bit unsettling, this sudden universal expertise. And how are these trades happening, you wonder? Especially when many of these precious bulbs are still comfortably nestled in the earth, months away from blooming, or even from being ready to lift and divide. This is where you encounter the infamous windhandel, literally, wind trade. People are no longer just trading physical bulbs. They're trading promises, slips of paper, hastily scribbled notes, even verbal agreements made over a round of drinks become the currency of this burgeoning market. These are, in essence, tulip futures. You might agree to buy a specific bulb, or even a fraction of a bulb's potential yield in offsets, for a certain price, to be delivered and paid for when the bulbs are lifted later in the year. This abstraction of the tulip, turning it from a tangible flower into an entry on a ledger or a verbal IOU, is what allows the trade to accelerate so dramatically. The actual physical flower becomes almost secondary to the idea of its escalating value. One quirky tidbit: you'll observe is the formation of informal trading groups or colleges that met regularly in these taverns. These weren't official exchanges with bells and tickers. They were often raucous gatherings where men, it was almost exclusively men in these public trading settings, would shout bids, make deals, and often seal them with a communal feast or round of drinks, sometimes funded by a small percentage of the transactions. Historians still argue whether these tavern-based trades were typically intended to be settled with the actual delivery of bulbs at the designated time, or if a significant portion of them were purely speculative bets on price movements, with participants hoping to sell their paper contracts at a profit before any real flower ever needed to change hands. It's like a high-stakes game of pass a parcel, but the parcel is an invisible bulb, and the music is the ever louder hum of speculative frenzy. You can almost imagine the scene. Someone slaps a piece of paper down on a sticky table. My Admiral. Van Horn, bulb, delivery in June, for 500 guilders. Another, emboldened by gin, shouts, I'll take it. And the deal is done, perhaps witnessed by a couple of equally merry companions. Good luck trying to enforce that contract. If the market turns sour, what contract? Oh, that beer-stained doodle. I thought that was your attempt at drawing a swan, Jan. The potential for misunderstanding, misrepresentation, and outright fraud in such an unregulated, alcohol-fueled environment is, as you can imagine, enormous. Yet, for now, the optimism is infectious. The dream of turning a few guilders into a fortune by correctly guessing the future price of a flower you might never even see is proving irresistible. The tavern, once a place for simple refreshment and camaraderie, has become a casino where the chips are petals and the stakes are rising with every passing day. The smoky haze of the tavern, as we saw, has become the unlikely new stock exchange, with promises of tulip fortunes floating in the air as thickly as the pipe tobacco fumes. But let's peer closer, shall we? Let's try to make out the faces in the crowd, because this isn't just an abstract economic event. It's a very human story, a tapestry woven from countless individual new money dreams. You begin to recognize some of the regulars, the diverse cast of characters caught in this floral whirlwind, each gambling their future on the delicate petals of a flower. There's Adrian, the weaver you saw earlier, his fingers, usually so deft with shuttle and loom, now nervously clutch a crumpled piece of paper, a contract for a share in a Vita Krunen bulb. You see him staring into the middle distance, perhaps imagining a life where his children don't have to squint in the dim light of the workshop, a home with a real glass window instead of oiled paper. For him, these tulips aren't just beautiful. They represent an escape hatch from the relentless, monotonous rhythm of his craft. Then there's Greety, the baker's wife, who, after much persuasion, has convinced her husband to invest their modest savings, the dowry from her late aunt, into a few promising paragon bulbs. She dreams of expanding their small bakery, perhaps even opening a stall in the main market square, picturing a life where the scent of fresh bread isn't constantly mingled with the anxiety of making ends meet. You might even spot a nobleman's son, a younger brother with no hope of inheriting the family estate, dabbing at the tavern trade with a kind of thrill-seeking curiosity. The stakes perhaps less dire for him, but the excitement just as palpable. Remember our blacksmith friend, the one who was suddenly an expert on floral varieties. You see him less at his forge these days, his hammer gathering a thin layer of dust, while he's off chasing rumors of a new bulb syndicate forming in a neighboring town. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Dutch Golden Age, for all its celebrated prosperity and advancements in art and science, was still a society with considerable social stratification. For many, particularly those in the middle and working classes, the traditional paths to significant wealth were long and arduous, if available at all. The tulip offered a dazzling, almost magical alternative. What truly fuels these financial dreams? It's more than simple greed, though that undoubtedly plays a part. For many, it's a potent cocktail of hope, ambition, and perhaps a touch of desperation. You see it in their eyes. The desire for a better life, for social mobility, for recognition. In an era where your birth often dictated your station, the tulip seemed like a great equalizer. If a common craftsman could, through a series of shrewd trades, afford a house as fine as a merchant's, what did that say about the old order? It was a seductive idea. You can just imagine the conversations in hushed tones within homes, the domestic sphere becoming a crucible for these new ambitions. Yes, dear, a hopeful husband might explain to his understandably skeptical wife, I know we sold the prize-winning pig to buy that Gouda bulb, but think of it. This bulb isn't just a bulb. It's a potential pig factory in floral form. It could buy us a dozen pigs next year, maybe even a small farm. The personal stakes, the impact on families and their daily lives, transform this from a mere economic bubble into a profound chapter of uncharted domesticity. And then there's the sheer infectiousness of it all, the psychology of the crowd. You witness firsthand the 17th century version of FOMO, the fear of missing out. Stories, whether true or wildly exaggerated, circulate through the taverns and marketplaces of fortunes made overnight. Did you hear about Jan van der Meer? Bought a Semper Augustus offset for the price of a goat, sold it a month later for enough to buy a canal house. Such tales, repeated and embellished, act like tinder on the flames of speculation. No one wants to be the fool who stood by and watched their neighbors get rich. One quirky tidbit that emerges from this period is the development of a surprisingly complex jargon around the tulip trade, even among the less educated. Suddenly, ordinary folk are discussing easing the weight of bulbs, predatory bulbs likely to perish, and plant-sown offsets for propagation with an air of seasoned expertise. This specialized language created a sense of belonging, an insider knowledge that further fueled the excitement. Historians still argue whether the widespread participation was driven more by a genuine, albeit misguided, belief in the ever-rising intrinsic value of these bulbs, or by an early iteration of the greater fool theory. The idea that you could safely buy at an inflated price because there would always be someone, even more foolish, willing to pay more down the line. Perhaps it was a bit of both, Lucan. Almost picture a clandestine meeting of the tulip widows and bewildered husbands support group, if such a thing had existed. My Willem, one might sigh, he used to talk about herring quotas and the price of timber. Now, it's all by Blomans this and Rotkins that. I haven't had a sensible conversation or a new pair of shoes in months. The lines between tangible value and speculative fancy are becoming increasingly blurred. You might even see someone try to barter with these paper promises. Imagine a fellow at the bar, a bit short on actual stewivers, confidently offering the barkeep, how about this? Promissory note for 1/16 of a Switzer's bulb, my good man. Deliverable next July, of course. Practically ready money, that is. The barkeep, if he's wise, probably asks for coin, but you can see the temptation flicker in his eyes too. Everyone, it seems, is dreaming of that one lucky trade, that one perfect bloom that will transform their ordinary existence into something extraordinary. The human element, with all its hopes, fears, and follies, is now firmly in the driver's seat of this runaway floral carriage. You've seen the faces in the crowd, felt the palpable thrum of their new money dreams, and witnessed how a simple flower has captivated an entire cross-section of Dutch society. Now, let's try to untangle the bizarre mechanics of how these dreams are being bought and sold, because you're about to navigate the dizzying, wonderfully unregulated world of windhandel, quite literally the wind trade. It's a term that perfectly captures the ephemeral, almost insubstantial nature of what's actually changing hands in those smoky taverns we've frequented. You see, as the frenzy grows, people are less and less trading actual physical tulip bulbs that they've dug up from their garden or held in their hand. Instead, they're trading promises, concepts, the potential of a bulb. They're trading air. Imagine yourself back in that bustling tavern, the air thick with anticipation. A deal is struck, not with the exchange of a weighty sack of bulbs, but with a hastily scribbled note on a scrap of paper, or sometimes just a hearty handshake and a shared tankard of ale over a verbal agreement. This is windhandel. It's the buying and selling of tulips that might still be in the ground, perhaps in a field hundreds of miles away. Sometimes it's for bulbs that haven't even properly formed yet. People are speculating on the future yield of offsets from a mother bulb, a floral dividend that may or may not materialize. There are no marble-columned exchanges here, no official brokers in smart coats. The mainstream historical fact is that while the Amsterdam Stock Exchange was indeed the first of its kind and already dealing in commodities and VOC shares, this tulip trade, especially among the common folk, operated far outside any formal, regulated structures. It was raw, unadulterated commerce, driven by rumor, hope, and a hefty dose of Dutch gin. The only ticker tape was the rising crescendo of excited voices. The only trading floor, the buy-a-sticky tables of the local pub. The instruments of this trade, if you can call them that, were as varied and informal as the settings. You'd see simple promissory notes. I, Jan, promise to deliver to you, Peter, 3 Admiral van Enkhuizen bulbs of specified weight in June for the sum of 300 guilders. But it quickly got more complex. People started trading shares in a single, exceptionally valuable bulb, because who could afford a whole Semper Augustus on their own? So, you might own 1/8 of a bulb, or a quarter. Then came options. The right to buy a bulb at a future date for a predetermined price. It's not a huge leap from I'll buy your bulb for 50 guilders next spring to I'll pay you 5 guilders now for the option to buy your bulb for 50 guilders next spring, if I so choose. You can just picture the evolution of a deal. It probably started with a straightforward, I'll buy your prize-winning tulip. Then it morphed into, I'll buy your tulip when it's ready to be lifted. Soon, it became, I'll buy the option to buy your prize-winning tulip. Specifically, the second largest offset it produces, provided it breaks with more purple than red. And only if my cousin Geert manages to sell his entire herring catch by the first Tuesday of April. It's a wonder anyone could keep track of these increasingly convoluted commitments, especially after a few rounds of drinks. This utterly unregulated market was, as you can imagine, fraught with peril. There was no oversight committee, no consumer protection agency for disappointed bulb buyers. If a deal went sour, if the promised bulb turned out to be diseased, or the wrong variety, or simply didn't exist, your avenues for recourse were limited. You could try social pressure, appealing to the witnesses in the tavern if they were sober enough to remember the deal accurately. You could, in theory, take someone to court, but the legal system was slow and often ill-equipped to deal with these novel, informal contracts based on such unusual commodities. Many were essentially trading on an invisible margin, committing to purchases far exceeding their actual ability to pay, banking on the ceaseless upward trajectory of prices to allow them to sell their contract at a profit before the bill ever truly came due. One quirky tidbit from the time is the proliferation of satirical pamphlets and prints that poked fun at this windhandel. These often depicted Flora, the goddess of flowers, being wooed by grotesque, money-grabbing speculators, or featured allegorical scenes of wind buyers grasping at empty air, highlighting a contemporary awareness among some that this whole enterprise was teetering on the absurd. Historians still argue whether the term windhandel was primarily a derogatory label coined by critics and those who later suffered losses, or if it was also used more neutrally, perhaps even with a hint of roguish pride by the participants themselves to describe their daring ventures into these futures. The closest thing to market regulation you'd find in these tavern exchanges was likely the volume of the loudest shouter or the perceived toughness of a trader's companions. It wasn't exactly the Securities and Exchange Commission ensuring fair play, was it? You can imagine the chaos, the potential for someone to sell the same non-existent bulb multiple times over to different unsuspecting buyers in different taverns. Oh, that note for a Generalissimo bulb. Yes, well, I sold that to young Willem, and to old Keys, and to that fellow from Utrecht with the eye patch. Surely one of them has it for you. Trying to trace the provenance of a particularly dubious paper promise would be a Sisyphean task. So, you track the note back through 5 increasingly inebriated previous owners. And it turns out the original commitment was from a fellow named Dirk, who mentioned something about sailing to Batavia last Tuesday. Best of luck getting your bulb from him, then. For now, though, such concerns are largely swept aside by the sheer, exhilarating momentum of it all. The wind trade is in full gust, creating a seemingly endless updraft for tulip prices, increasingly detached from the earthy reality of the flowers themselves, powered by little more than collective optimism and the intoxicating ease of trading these airy, whimsical promises. You've navigated the murky, exhilarating waters of the windhandel, where promises are as solid as the smoke in the taverns, and fortunes are built on air and optimism. Now, brace yourself, because you are about to witness the dizzying, almost unbelievable crescendo of this floral symphony, the absolute peak of tulip lunacy. This is the moment where the line between investment and outright fantasy blurs into non-existence, where single flower stems, or rather, the promise of them, are achieving values that would make a king blush. You're standing at the very summit of Mount Absurdity, and the view is both breathtaking and terrifying. Stories begin to circulate, each more incredible than the last, of the extraordinary prices being paid for the most coveted bulbs. These aren't just whispers anymore. They're shouted in the marketplaces, boasted about in the taverns, and recorded, sometimes with wide-eyed disbelief, in pamphlets and personal diaries. The mainstream historical fact is that during the winter of 1636 and into early 1637, the prices for rare tulip bulbs, particularly the fashionable broken varieties, reached astronomical heights. We're not just talking about a few extra we're talking about people reportedly trading entire houses, plots of fertile land, carriages complete with horses, whole herds of livestock, or lifetime annuities for a single tulip bulb. Imagine pointing to a sturdy, respectable brick house on a pleasant canal and saying, "Yes, that's lovely. I'll trade you that for this bulb here." No, not the whole sack, just this one. The Viceroy with the particularly fetching flame pattern. It sounds like a jest, a tall tale spun by a fireside, yet these transactions, or at least the fervent belief in them, are happening. You see a prosperous merchant, someone you'd consider shrewd and level-headed, anxiously inspecting a tiny, dormant bulb in his palm, as if it were the most precious jewel in the world. And in the currency of this moment, it very nearly is. Fortunes, it seems, are indeed being made, or at least appearing to be made, on the fragile promise held. Within these unassuming little orbs, the impact on everyday life and aspirations, that uncharted domesticity we've been tracing, is profound. Remember Adrian the weaver, or Greety the baker's wife, who tentatively dipped their toes into the market. Now, you might see them, or people just like them, suddenly paper-rich. Their modest investments, through a series of rapid trades in the windhandel, have ballooned, at least in theory, into sums they could never have imagined earning through years of honest toil. You can almost hear the mental redecorating happening across the Dutch Republic. Martha Darling, a newly minted tulip magnate, might exclaim to his wife, "Cancel the order for those plain wooden shutters we talked about." Our Admiral Van Hoon. Share just doubled in value overnight. We're getting lavish velvet curtains, imported from Lyon, and perhaps a small, tastefully ostentatious fountain in the courtyard. For the future tulips, of course. The financial dreams are no longer distant hopes. They feel tantalizingly real, as solid as the numbers being chalked up on tavern blackboards. People are behaving as if this new wealth is permanent, as if these flower-based fortunes are as rooted and reliable as the ancient oaks. This period, the dead of winter, 1636, through to the first weeks of 1637, is when the mania truly bites. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Much of this frenetic high-stakes trading is happening while the bulbs themselves are dormant, invisible, buried under inches of cold, hard earth. It adds another layer of abstraction, of pure faith, to the whole enterprise. They're not even trading the sight of a beautiful flower, just the deeply buried potential of one, based on its reputation and the escalating desire of everyone else to own that same unseen potential. The atmosphere is electric, a kind of collective effervescence where optimism is king and skepticism is dismissed as timidity or foolishness. Historians still argue about the true extent and nature of these peak prices. Were these widely recorded? Exchanges of houses and farms for single bulbs common, documented transactions, or were they perhaps more isolated, sensationalized instances, possibly fueled by bravado and copious amounts of alcohol in specific tavern bidding wars, which then got amplified into legend? It's difficult to say with certainty how many people genuinely traded their ancestral homes for a flower, but the belief that such values were attainable was undeniably widespread and incredibly powerful. It's hard not to draw a parallel to some modern speculative bubbles, perhaps those internet meme stocks that suddenly shoot to the moon. You can almost hear a 17th century Dutch speculator, his eyes gleaming with conviction, explaining his strategy. It's not about the flower, man. It's about the movement. Semper Augustus to the stars. Diamond hands, brother. Or whatever the period equivalent might have been. The shared belief itself creates the value for a time. You might even witness a comic scene where some hopeful soul, flush with his Paper Tulip Gaines tries to leverage this newfound wealth in a more traditional setting. Imagine him approaching a stern, old-fashioned banker. "Good master banker," he might say, puffing out his chest. "I understand your usual preference for land deeds or shipments of spice as collateral, but allow me to present this. A promissory note for 1/1 of a Semper Augustus bulb. It's practically a small duchy in floral form. Observe the delicate veining described in this expert's certificate. Pure profit, I assure you." The banker, stroking his beard and peering over his spectacles, probably remains thoroughly unimpressed. But out in the wilder world of the tulip trade, such an asset is considered golden. For this fleeting, extraordinary moment, the entire Dutch nation, or at least a very significant and noisy part of it, seems to have suspended its collective disbelief. The lunacy is at its absolute zenith. The air crackles with guilders that exist only in imagination, and the fall, when it comes, will be from a very great, very dizzying height indeed. You've witnessed the absolute zenith of the tulip lunacy, where legendary bulbs like Semper Augustus were trading for fortunes that could set a family up for generations, at least on paper. The air itself seemed to crackle with the phantom value of these floral superstars. But what about those who couldn't dream of affording even a tiny fraction of such an elite bulb? What about your average Jan or Greety, whose entire life savings might only amount to a few dozen guilders, not the thousands demanded for a viceroy? Well, as you continue to observe this fascinating societal fever, you'll see that the speculative desire, like a particularly invasive but beautiful weed, starts to spread its tendrils far beyond the realm of the ultra-rare. Every bulb, it seems, is about to become a prize. The trickle-down effect is in full swing. While the connoisseurs and the truly wealthy are still obsessing over the unique patterns of those virus-infected, broken bulbs, a new wave of enthusiasm begins to swell around more humble varieties. Those solid-colored tulips, the selfs, perhaps a sturdy Gouda yellow, or a respectable lac, Van Rijn red, which were once just pleasant, reliable blooms for any modest garden, suddenly find themselves caught up in the whirlwind. You'll notice the shift in the tavern chatter, while tales of the eye-watering prices for rare specimens still circulate. More and more conversations now revolve around the potential of these commoners. Old Piet's patch of Switzers looked particularly vigorous this year. Someone might lean in and confide, "I reckon those will be worth a pretty penny come lifting time." The focus subtly expands from unique artistry to sheer potential for appreciation, any appreciation, across the board. It's as if the dazzling success of the high-end bulbs has cast a golden glow over the entire tulip family, making even the plainest cousin seem like a princess in disguise. This broadening of the market is facilitated by a key development, and this is a mainstream historical fact. During the later, more frenetic stages of tulipomania, a significant trade emerged in common bulbs, often sold not by individual unique characteristics, but simply by weight. Per ease, a small unit of weight, about 0.05 grams or pond-pound. These became known as pond gold, pound goods, or sometimes, with a touch of hopeful marketing, noble dirt. This system made it incredibly easy for even the smallest investor to get in on the action. You might not be able to afford a named variety, but you could certainly scrape together enough for a few easen of mixed unnamed bulbs, hoping that the rising tide would lift all floral boats. It's like the high-end, bespoke art market suddenly finding a parallel in people frantically trading in prints, posters, or even, let's be honest, your child's charmingly chaotic macaroni pictures. Look at the impressive heft on this bag of miscellaneous bulb-shaped objects. A hopeful speculator might exclaim, pure investment-grade pasta art. I mean, petal potential. These are bound to follow the Semper Augustus to the moon. The emphasis shifts from the connoisseurship of rare beauty to a more democratic, if equally irrational, gamble on sheer quantity and the momentum of the craze. The psychology driving this mass participation is fascinating to observe. Why would people invest their hard-earned money in bulbs that had no particular rarity or unique beauty to recommend them? Part of it, undoubtedly, is the pervasive belief that all tulips are now on an unstoppable upward trajectory. If the admirals and generals are conquering the financial world, surely the humble foot soldiers of the tulip army will see their value increase too. The greater fool theory we touched upon becomes even more pertinent here. You buy a sack of common bulbs not because you believe they're intrinsically worth the inflated price, but because you're confident there's someone else, an even greater fool, just around the corner, who will buy them from you for a little bit more. It's the desire to simply be in the game, to participate in the excitement, even if you're playing at the penny ante tables rather than the high roller suites. One quirky tidbit from the era is that certain taverns apparently became known as hotspots for trading these cheaper pound goods, creating a sort of parallel shadow market for the less affluent. You can imagine these places, perhaps a bit rougher around the edges than the establishments frequented by wealthier merchants, buzzing with their own unique brand of speculative fervor, complete with hot tips on which common variety was supposedly the next to explode in value. PST mate, word on the street is that plain old yellow crown is about to take off. Old man Jupe heard it from his cousin, who knows a guy whose aunt's gardener once saw a Semper Augustus. Historians still argue about the degree to which this trade in common bulbs was driven by a genuine, albeit profoundly misguided, belief in their intrinsic appreciating value versus simply being a more accessible and thrilling form of gambling. For the masses, a lottery where the tickets just happen to be flower bulbs. The conversations become almost comically earnest. Quick, sell the chickens and the good Sunday coat. You might hear someone exclaim with breathless urgency, young Dirk's plain red Rotterdamer bulbs are up by 2 whole stuivers since this morning. We've got to get in before they hit. Well, before they hit the dizzying heights of perhaps 5 stuivers, more than they were yesterday. There's also a desperate attempt by some to find unique selling propositions for their utterly unremarkable wares. Yes, I grant you, it appears to be a standard Cower demis. My friend, a hopeful seller might argue, holding up a perfectly ordinary-looking bulb, but observe, this one has a slightly more pronounced basal ridge, a sign of vigor that clearly makes it a Cowler Demis Special Ridge Edition, surely worth an extra 10 guilders for such a rare feature. The mania, it seems, has now permeated every level of the tulip market. The critical distinction between the truly rare and the utterly commonplace is dissolving under the universal solvent of speculative desire. This broadening of the base, while making the game accessible to nearly everyone, also makes the entire glittering structure incredibly top-heavy and profoundly precarious. Every bulb is now a prize, which means the fall, when it comes, will be felt by all. So, you've seen the tulip mania reach a point where every humble bulb, every fistful of noble dirt, is seen as a potential lottery ticket to untold riches. The entire nation, it seems, is caught in this fragrant, colorful whirlwind of speculation. The sheer breadth of participation is astounding, from the wealthiest merchant princes down to the cobblers and chimney sweeps, all dreaming those potent financial dreams. But as you wander through these bustling scenes of unbridled optimism, your ear, now attuned to the nuances of this floral fever, begins to pick up something new. A faint, almost imperceptible counter-melody beneath the boisterous chorus of speculation. These are the first whispers of doubt, the cautious voices questioning the sustainability of this blooming financial fantasy. It's subtle at first. Perhaps you notice it in a tavern, amidst the usual clamor of bids and boasts. A seasoned merchant, older and perhaps a little weathered by previous economic tides, shakes his head slowly as a particularly outrageous price is paid for a common bulb. He says nothing, but his silence, his raised eyebrow, speaks volumes. Or maybe you see a flicker of unease in the eyes of a young man who has just pledged his inheritance for a handful of promissory notes. A sudden pallor as the initial excitement wears off and the magnitude of his gamble sinks in. The joviality in some of these trading dens, if you listen closely, can sound a little forced. The laughter a shade too loud, as if to drown out a creeping, unspoken anxiety. The air, while still thick with ambition, now carries a faint, almost indiscernible scent of apprehension. Slowly, these quiet reservations begin to find voice. They come from predictable quarters, perhaps the pulpits, for one. You might overhear a stern Calvinist preacher, his voice thundering with moral conviction, railing against the sin of avarice, the folly of placing one's faith in earthly treasures as ephemeral as a flower that blooms and fades. Verily, he might declare, his gaze sweeping over his congregation, many of whom are likely tulip speculators themselves. It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a man whose heart is set on Semper Augustus to enter the kingdom of heaven, especially if he acquired said bulb using funds meant for the church roof appeal. Then there are the more conservative members of the merchant class, men who built their fortunes through tangible goods, timber, textiles, herring, not through airy promises for flowers. They grumble about the neglect of real business, about young men abandoning honest trades to chase these floral phantoms. Their arguments are often grounded in a pragmatic assessment of intrinsic value. A tulip is beautiful, yes, but can you eat it? Can you build a house with it? Can it keep you warm in winter? Beyond its fleeting aesthetic appeal, what lasting worth does it truly possess? This questioning of value is a key theme among the skeptics. The mainstream historical fact is that during this period, a significant body of critical literature emerged, often in the form of pamphlets and satirical prints, collectively known as Goethe Fool's cap literature. These publications directly attacked the speculative excesses, portraying the traders as fools and the mania as a dangerous collective delusion. Naturally, in the euphoric heights of the boom, such cautious voices and moralizing critiques are largely dismissed by the enthusiastic majority. Imagine trying to be the designated driver at a party where everyone else is convinced they can fly. You'd be met with ridicule, accusations of being a killjoy, or simply blank incomprehension. You just don't understand, old man. A young speculator, flushed with recent paper profits, might scoff at a doubting elder. This is the new economy. Flowers are the future. You're stuck in the past with your actual physical goods. The social pressure to conform, to share in the boundless optimism, is immense. To express doubt is to risk being ostracized. to be seen as someone who just doesn't get it. Yet, these dissenting opinions do circulate. One quirky tidbit is the likely existence of satirical songs or poems passed around subversively that poked fun not just at the general madness, but specifically at the gullibility of those still eagerly buying at peak prices. These would have been the 17th century equivalent of sharing cynical memes in a private group chat, a way for the skeptics to find a little solidarity. Historians still argue about how widespread these dissenting voices truly were at the peak of the mania, or if they were largely drowned out by the overwhelming cacophony of speculative excitement, only gaining traction when the first visible cracks began to appear. It's a classic case of everyone's a genius in a bull market. And conversely, no one wants to hear bad news when the party is in full swing. Despite the dismissals and the derision, these whispers of doubt, these satirical jabs, begin to sow tiny, almost invisible seeds. You, as our ever-present observer, might notice a previously confident trader hesitating for just a moment longer than usual before shouting his bid. You might see someone make a bold purchase and then, when they think no one is looking, quickly and nervously recalculate their potential losses should the music suddenly stop. Perhaps someone loudly proclaims the eternal value of their admiral Leifkun's collection, then excuses himself to the alley, not for a breath of fresh air, but to discreetly inquire if anyone knows a buyer for, say, a slightly used carriage, just in case. The unwavering, almost religious faith in the ever-upward trajectory of tulip prices is beginning to show the faintest of hairline cracks. The grand orchestra of Tulipomania is still playing its deafening, exhilarating symphony, but a few of the musicians are starting to nervously glance at their sheet music, wondering if they've missed a crucial signal for the finale. You've felt those first faint tremors of doubt, heard the hushed whispers of caution that dare to question the eternal glory of the tulip. The party, while still loud, has a nervous edge. Now, my friend, take a deep breath, because you are about to witness the moment the music abruptly stops. The moment the floor gives way, the moment the vibrant, intoxicating colors of the tulip market begin to drain away, revealing a much starker, more sobering reality. This is it. The bubble bursts. It doesn't necessarily start with a thunderclap, a single, dramatic event that screams financial apocalypse. Instead, it's often more insidious, a creeping chill that begins to permeate the overheated atmosphere. The mainstream historical fact generally points to early February 1637 as the turning point. Specifically, an auction in Harlem is often cited. You can imagine the scene. A crowd gathered, perhaps not as large or as boisterous as in previous weeks. The auctioneer presents a prized bulb, its lineage and virtues extolled as usual. But when he calls for bids, there's a hesitation, a silence that stretches just a fraction too long. The usual eager hands are slow to rise. A bid is made, perhaps, but it's lower than expected. Another bulb, then another. The prices, instead of leaping ever upwards, stagnate, or worse, inch downwards. A few key bulbs, which were expected to fetch princely sums, fail to sell at all, or are sold for significantly less than they were valued just days before. You see a forced smile on the auctioneer's face, a nervous cough from a prominent dealer, a sudden stillness that feels far more ominous than the usual excited clamor. It's like watching a tiny crack appear in a magnificent stained glass window. Small at first, but it changes everything. The news, as bad news often does, spreads with astonishing speed. Whispers turn into anxious murmurs, then into panicked shouts that echo through the taverns and across the market squares. Did you hear? Prices in Harlem are falling. They say no one is buying in Alkmaar. That chilling realization we talked about, the fear that you might be the greater fool, begins to dawn with brutal clarity on thousands of speculators. Suddenly, everyone wants to sell. But to sell, you need a buyer, and buyers are becoming as rare as a Semper Augustus was once thought to be. Those who had bought common bulbs by weight, that noble dirt they hoped would turn to gold, now find their sacks of Switzers or Gouders are, well, just sacks of very ordinary and rapidly devaluing bulbs. It's like that classic cartoon moment, isn't it? While E. Coyote runs full tilt off a cliff, legs still churning, suspended for a moment by sheer, blissful ignorance and forward momentum, before he makes the fatal mistake of looking down. The Dutch tulip market, my friends, has just looked down, and it's discovering there's nothing but a vast expanse of empty air beneath its feet. This triggers a terrifying cascade. Remember all those windhandel deals, those promises to pay for bulbs at a future date, often at prices that were wildly inflated even a week ago. Now, those promises are coming due, or the sellers are trying to cash them in before prices fall further. But the buyers, the ones who optimistically pledged their homes, their businesses, their entire futures on the ever-rising value of a flower, are suddenly unable or unwilling to pay. Panic selling ensues. Prices don't just drift downwards, they plummet. That bulb you bought for 1,000 guilders yesterday, hoping to sell for 1,200 today, you'd be lucky to get 500 for it now. Tomorrow, perhaps 100. The next day, maybe someone will offer you a herring for it, if you're lucky. One quirky tidbit from contemporary accounts describes how some of the more heavily invested, or perhaps less scrupulous, traders literally vanished. They packed their bags in the dead of night and fled their towns, leaving behind angry creditors, worthless promissory notes, and shattered dreams. Historians still argue about the precise speed and trajectory of this initial crash, whether it was a cataclysmic plunge over a mere handful of days, or a more staggered, though still terrifyingly rapid, decline that rippled through different towns and social strata over several weeks as the grim news spread and the full implications sank in. Whatever the exact timeline, the emotional landscape is irrevocably altered. The euphoria, the boundless optimism, the sheer, giddy joy of the ascent, it all evaporates, replaced by a miasma of fear, anger, bewilderment, and bitter recrimination. Those beautiful, intricate tulip contracts, once seen as deeds too untold, wealth, are now revealed to be little more than expensive, heartbreakingly useless pieces of paper. You could probably wallpaper a rather large and exceptionally depressing room with all the defaulted futures contracts for Admiral Leaf and Generalissimo bulbs. The vibrant colors that painted the nation's financial dreams are fading to a dull, miserable gray. The taverns, so recently echoing with triumphant bids and celebratory songs, now fall into stunned silences, broken only by the occasional muttered curse or the sound of someone quietly weeping into their rapidly warming beer over the sudden, brutal demise of their flower-based fortune. It's a somber, chilling transformation, like watching a magnificent, brightly lit carnival suddenly have all its lights extinguished at once, leaving everyone stumbling in the dark, wondering where all the magic went. The bubble, with all its iridescent, captivating beauty, has definitively, irrevocably burst. The vibrant, intoxicating colors of the tulip market have, as we've just seen, bled out with astonishing speed, leaving behind a landscape washed in the stark, unsettling tones of financial winter. The party is most definitely over. You now find yourself walking through the aftermath, a period of grim reckoning where the scale of the financial wreckage and the depth of shattered domestic hopes become painfully clear. The air, once electric with excitement and the buzz of instant fortunes, now hangs heavy with disbelief, recrimination, and a quiet, pervasive despair. In the days and weeks that followed the crash of early February 1637, a stunned silence descends upon many of the places that were once epicenters of the trade, those bustling taverns. Many are now subdued, half empty, the boisterous laughter replaced by hushed, anxious conversations or simply the clinking of a solitary drinker's tankard. You see faces etched with worry, eyes that dart around nervously, perhaps looking for creditors or for anyone who might offer a sliver of hope. A rumor that prices might rebound, a hope that you sense is already dying. The streets themselves seem quieter. The frantic energy of commerce, at least the commerce related to tulips, has stalled. You might pass the once proud home of a merchant who fancied himself a tulip king, only to see its windows shuttered, its grand door firmly closed, as if the inhabitants can't bear to face the world, or perhaps are no longer there. And what of Adrian, the weaver, who dreamt of escaping his loom, or Greety, the baker's wife, who poured her modest inheritance into visions of a grander shop? Their uncharted domesticity, those bright blueprints for a more prosperous home life, are now largely in ruins. Their dreams, like so many dried petals, have crumbled. The impact on homes and families is where the abstract financial numbers translate into tangible human suffering. This is where those shattered domestic hopes truly hit home. For some, it's the loss of savings painstakingly accumulated over years. For others, who pledged their homes or businesses as collateral for loans to buy yet more bulbs at inflated prices, it means actual dispossession. The bailiffs at the door. You hear stories of inheritances squandered, dowries vanished, partnerships dissolved in bitter accusations, marriages, once buoyed by shared dreams of floral fortunes, are now strained to breaking point under the weight of debt and disappointment. The social climbing that seemed so effortless on the way up becomes a rapid, humiliating descent. Their fine velvet suit, bought in anticipation of tulip riches, now hangs mockingly in the wardrobe, a reminder of a status that was never truly achieved. You might see a formerly respected craftsman who neglected his trade to chase tulip profits, now struggling to find work, his reputation tarnished, his tools rusty. The shame is a palpable thing. A formerly proud merchant might be seen trying to subtly offload some household treasure. Perhaps his wife's second-best silver candlesticks never really matched the drapes. You know, he might mumble to a potential buyer, a blush creeping up his neck. The drapes, of course, were themselves an optimistic purchase funded by anticipated tulip gains and might well be the next item on the discreet liquidation list. Amidst this personal and communal despair, there's the practical, messy business of trying to untangle the web of defaulted windhandel deals. This is where the mainstream historical fact comes in. While the lasting, economy-wide devastation of tulipomania is something historians debate, there's little doubt it caused acute financial distress and ruin for many individuals who had been caught up in the speculative frenzy, particularly those who had bought heavily on credit or with leveraged promissory notes. Those slips of paper, once traded with such confidence, are now the subject of furious arguments. buyers who promised to pay exorbitant sums for bulbs that are now virtually worthless are quite understandably defaulting in droves. Sellers, holding these defaulted contracts, are demanding payment, their own solvency often depending on it. You witness tense meetings in guild halls, in private homes, even in the Nasamba taverns, where debtors plead for mercy and creditors demand their due. It's a chaotic, heartbreaking ballet of broken promises. One quirky tidbit from this period is that in some towns, desperate civic leaders or merchant guilds attempted to impose some order on the chaos by setting up informal arbitration committees. These bodies tried to broker settlements, often proposing that contracts be honored at a small fraction of their original value, say 5 or 10%, as a way to allow both sides to cut their losses and move on. However, these resolutions rarely had legal teeth and often satisfied no one completely. The sellers felt cheated out of what they believed was owed, and the buyers still felt they were paying too much for something that had lost almost all its value. Historians still argue about the overall severity and long-term impact of tulipomania on the broader Dutch economy. Some argue it was a dramatic but relatively isolated speculative bubble, its fallout largely confined to the speculators themselves, with the robust Dutch economy absorbing the shock fairly quickly. Others suggest it had more significant, albeit perhaps localized and temporary, ripple effects on credit availability and general commercial confidence. Trying to get a defaulting buyer to now honor a tulip contract from the peak of the mania is, you imagine, like trying to convince a cat to willingly take a long, luxurious bath using only the power of polite suggestion. There will be a lot of indignant sputtering, some frantic attempts to escape, and ultimately, you'll likely just end up feeling rather damp and thoroughly defeated. The new must-have fashion accessory for anyone who is heavily involved in the tulip speculation. Exceptionally deep pockets, primarily because they are now mostly empty. That, and a permanently pained expression that appears whenever someone innocently mentions how lovely the spring flowers are looking. The vibrant dreams have well and truly wilted, leaving a bitter scent of regret hanging in the Dutch air. The immediate shock of the crash has passed, leaving behind a landscape littered with financial wreckage and the ghosts of those bright domestic dreams. You've walked through this somber aftermath, witnessing the personal cost of the tulip dream's demise. Now, as the dust begins to settle, or rather, as the mud of recrimination begins to fly, you observe the next inevitable phase, the messy, often futile, search for justice, for restitution, and, perhaps most urgently for someone to blame. The courts fill up, the arguments grow louder, and the blame game commences in earnest. You see them. The throngs of hopeful plaintiffs and sullen defendants, crowding the corridors of town halls and courthouses. These are often the same people who, just weeks ago, were enthusiastically clinking glasses in taverns, partners in the grand floral speculation. Now, they face each other across a chasm of broken contracts and bitter accusations. The primary challenge for the legal system is immense. Many of those windhandel contracts, as we've discussed, were informal at best, verbal agreements made in noisy inns, scribbled notes on scraps of paper, often witnessed by individuals whose memory might be conveniently hazy or selectively impaired by the copious amounts of beer or gin consumed at the time. The mainstream historical fact here is that Dutch courts and municipal authorities, when faced with these disputes, were generally very reluctant to enforce the speculative tulip contracts at their original, wildly inflated values. Many magistrates viewed these as gambling debts rather than legitimate commercial transactions, and gambling debts were often legally unenforceable, or, at the very least, highly disreputable. You can imagine a judge peering over his spectacles at a plaintiff demanding 10,000 guilders for a bulb that is now worth less than a turnip, struggling to maintain his judicial composure. So, what did the authorities do? For the most part, there was no grand, centralized government bailout or systematic attempt to unwind every tangled deal. The provincial states and the States General, the higher bodies of Dutch governance, largely preferred to let local municipalities handle the fallout. They might issue vague pronouncements urging calm and fair dealing, or suggest that parties negotiate amicable settlements. But there was little appetite for direct intervention that might be seen as rewarding reckless speculation. You might picture a weary government official, besieged by a delegation of irate former tulip traders demanding that something, anything, be done to restore their lost fortunes. He'd likely sigh, adjust his ruff, and perhaps gently suggest that as a general principle for future endeavors, investing one's entire estate, the family silver, and the neighbor's prize-winning pig into a flower bulb whose primary characteristic is its unpredictable price fluctuation might not be the most prudent long-term financial strategy. Groundbreaking advice, truly, and cold comfort to those whose ships have already sunk. The informal arbitration committees we saw earlier, those local attempts to mediate, continued their work. But their lack of legal authority to enforce their proposed settlements, often a mere 10% or even 3.5% of the contract value, meant that many disputes remained unresolved, festering like an untended wound, with legal avenues often proving frustratingly ineffective or offering only meager compensation. The human need to find a target for all this anger and loss intensifies. The blame game begins. Who is responsible for this disaster? Initially, it's often simply the person on the other side of a defaulted contract, the buyer who won't pay, the seller who delivered a worthless bulb. But as the scale of the collective misfortune becomes apparent, the search for scapegoats broadens. Those satirical pamphlets and moralizing sermons you encountered earlier now find a much more receptive audience. They help to shape a narrative, often identifying villains in the form of greedy, unprincipled speculators who supposedly duped the innocent, or the naive newcomers whose ignorant enthusiasm allegedly fueled the worst excesses. One quirky tidbit is that, as often happens in times of crisis and confusion, blame was sometimes directed towards specific minority groups or even foreigners, with dark whispers of organized plots to manipulate the market and defraud honest Dutchmen. There's little concrete historical evidence to support such conspiracy theories regarding tulipomania, but it speaks to a common human tendency to find an other to hold responsible when complex systems fail or when our own judgment proves flawed. Historians still argue about the extent to which there were identifiable villains or deliberate market manipulators who consciously orchestrated the boom and bust, versus it being a more organic, collective, speculative mania where most participants, big and small, were simply caught up in the momentum, each hoping to be smarter or luckier than the last. The sheer absurdity of the situation isn't lost on some. You can almost hear the gallows humor. Everyone's pointing fingers, a wry observer might note. It's like a very elaborate, multi-layered game of he said, she sold me the wind. But then he promised the offsets from a bulb that turned out to be a rotten onion, and she swore it was a Semper Augustus, when it was clearly just a common garden weed. It's enough to give you a splitting headache, even if you haven't just lost your ancestral home. If they could have put an actual tulip bulb on trial for reckless endangerment of public financial health, and perhaps excessive destabilizing prettiness, they probably would have given it serious consideration. We find the defendant, Madame Viceroy. The imaginary prosecutor might declare, guilty on all counts of being far too darn irresistible for your own good, and for ours. But alas, blaming the flowers themselves, however tempting, offers little solace. The legal battles splutter, the blame is diffuse and unsatisfying, and most individuals are left to grapple with their losses in bitter isolation, the phantom riches, replaced by very real debts and a lingering sense of foolishness. The search for justice often just uncovers more layers of complication and shared culpability. The bitter taste of blame and the frustration of unresolved legal battles eventually begin to fade, not into happy resolution, but into a kind of weary resignation for many. You've seen the raw, painful, immediate aftermath of the tulip market's collapse. Now, let's step back a little further and consider the longer, more subtle echoes of this floral frenzy. How did this extraordinary period of collective madness reshape Dutch society, its views on wealth, and its understanding of itself? Because an event this dramatic, this bizarre, doesn't just vanish without a trace. It leaves ripples. Life, as it always does, eventually begins to find a new, more sober rhythm. The immediate crisis subsides. People, with varying degrees of success, pick up the pieces of their shattered finances and, perhaps more importantly, their shattered confidence. Those who still have their traditional trades, the weavers, the bakers, the shipbuilders, return to them, perhaps with a newfound appreciation for the slow, steady accumulation of wealth through honest labor, rather than the dizzying of speculation. You notice a lingering atmosphere of caution, a certain sheepishness, when the topic of the recent tulip time comes up in conversation. It's like a collective hangover after a particularly wild party that everyone vaguely regrets, but can't quite forget. And when spring arrives, as it unfailingly does, and the tulips themselves push through the earth, vibrant and beautiful as ever, you see people admiring them, but perhaps with a different gaze, one that mixes appreciation for their beauty, with a faint, knowing wince at the memory of the folly they once inspired. One of the most significant long-term impacts is arguably on the Dutch psyche concerning wealth and speculation. This is a nation known for its pragmatism, its Calvinistic emphasis on thrift, diligence, and sobriety. The Tulipomania, in many ways, stands as a stark, almost theatrical aberration from this perceived national character. Did it cure the Dutch of speculative urges forever? Unlikely. Human nature is, after all, remarkably consistent. But the mainstream historical fact is that while the Dutch economy as a whole remained robust and the Golden Age continued its course for decades, the Tulipomania entered Dutch cultural memory as a powerful, enduring cautionary tale about the perils of speculative excess and crowd madness. For a generation or two, you can imagine that if anyone in a Dutch tavern, no matter how respectably dressed, even began to whisper about a guaranteed, can't-miss investment opportunity, especially if it involved anything that grew in the dirt and wasn't immediately edible or usable for building a ship, they'd likely be met with a room full of stony glares, and perhaps be gently but firmly escorted outside for a breath of fresh air and a collective, unsolicited lecture on the virtues of tangible assets. The social and cultural echoes are also discernible. Those satirical pamphlets and foolscap prints that lampooned the speculators during and immediately after the crisis become part of the historical record. shaping how future generations would understand the event. The memory of fortunes made and lost with such bewildering speed subtly underscores discussions about class, ambition, and the true meaning of prosperity. Those financial dreams that burned so brightly are now viewed with a much more jaundiced eye, perhaps tainted by the widespread ruin they ultimately caused for so many. A quirky tidbit, and a testament to its enduring impact, is that the very term tulipomania or tulpenwoud in Dutch became an idiomatic shorthand, not just in the Netherlands, but across Europe and indeed for centuries thereafter, to describe any large-scale, irrational, speculative bubble. Whenever a new generation got caught up in some improbable investment craze, from the South Sea bubble in England a century later to perhaps even some of the more, shall we say, aromatic cryptocurrency fads of more recent times, someone would inevitably invoke the ghost of tulipomania as a warning. Historians still argue about the depth and duration of the moral panic or societal introspection that followed the crash. Was it a profound, soul-searching moment that led to significant, lasting changes in Dutch financial regulations or social attitudes? Or was it more of a temporary, albeit sharp, shock, with old habits and human inclinations reasserting themselves once the immediate pain subsided? You might hear grandparents, in the decades that followed, spinning cautionary tales for their wide-eyed grandchildren, the flickering candlelight adding a dramatic flair. And so, little Peter, they might intone gravely, that is why our family invests its hard-earned guilders in solid, boring things like shares in the herring fleet, or sensible, sturdy windmills that drain the potters, and not in flamboyant flowers that promise you a nobleman's estate but deliver only a wheelbarrow full of very expensive compost. The resilience of the Dutch people, however, is also on display. The nation doesn't collapse. Amsterdam remains a vital center of global trade. Art and science continue to flourish. The tulip itself, stripped of its speculative madness, eventually finds its way back to being simply a flower, albeit a particularly beloved one, as we shall see. The tulip probably let out a huge sigh of relief, if bulbs could sigh. Finally, it might have thought, feeling the speculative fever break, I can just stand here and be admired for my lovely colors, without everyone trying to calculate my resale value against the price of a small brewery or a moderately sized Frisian dairy farm. The pressure was frankly getting unbearable. The mania left its scars, certainly, and it instilled a degree of caution. But it also became a story, a legend, a peculiar and unforgettable chapter in the rich history of this dynamic nation. The long echo of the frenzy would serve as a reminder of that time when sober reason, for a brief, dazzling moment, surrendered to the intoxicating allure of a simple bloom. The echoes of the great tulipomania, with its cautionary tales and sober reflections on wealth, have now become part of the rich tapestry of Dutch history. You've seen society grapple with the aftermath, assign blame, and slowly, painstakingly, find its footing again. But what of the flower itself, the innocent catalyst for all this human drama? Does it fade into obscurity, forever tainted by its association with financial ruin and folly? Not at all. In fact, you're about to witness the tulip's remarkable third act. Its journey from an object of frenzied speculation to an enduring and beloved symbol of Dutch culture and horticultural pride, as the years, then decades, pass after the crash of 1637, the raw, painful memories of fortunes lost begin to soften. The tulip, once viewed with a mixture of desire and dread, starts to be seen once more for what it truly is: a flower of exceptional beauty and variety. The deep-rooted Dutch passion for horticulture, which predated the mania and certainly survived. It reasserts itself. You see tulips reappearing in gardens, not as high-stakes investments displayed behind locked gates, but as sources of simple, domestic pleasure. Their vibrant colors once again grace the neat flower beds in front of modest homes and the grander parterres of estates. Their presence no longer signaling reckless gambling, but rather a love for nature's artistry. It's a quiet rehabilitation, a return to innocence for the bloom that once drove a nation to the brink of collective madness. You can almost sense the relief in the spring air. Tulips are beautiful again, without the crushing weight of expectation. Fast forward through the centuries, and you find that the tulip hasn't just been forgiven for its role in the 1630s drama. It has been elevated to the status of a national icon, inextricably linked with the identity of the Netherlands. This is the ultimate comeback story. The mainstream historical fact is that today, the Netherlands is the world's largest commercial producer of tulip bulbs, exporting billions of them annually. Vast, meticulously cultivated fields of tulips transform swaths of the Dutch countryside into breathtaking carpets of color each spring, attracting tourists from every corner of the globe. Places like the Keukenhof Gardens, a veritable living museum of tulips and other bulb flowers, showcase the astounding variety and beauty that Dutch growers have achieved. It's quite a journey for our floral protagonist, isn't it? From causing financial chaos and being lampooned as Dame Flora leading fools to ruin, to now being the star of countless glossy Visit Holland brochures and a million perfectly composed Instagram posts talk about a reputational makeover. The tulip is no longer a symbol of speculative folly, but of Dutch ingenuity, agricultural prowess, and an enduring appreciation for beauty. This enduring charm is also rooted in a continued and far more rational horticultural interest. The Dutch expertise in breeding, cultivating, and hybridizing tulips, an art and a science, has only grown over the centuries. While the virus-induced broken tulips of the mania are now understood and generally avoided in commercial growing due to their weakening effect on the bulb stock, the desire for patterned and unusually colored tulips persists. Modern breeders have developed countless stable varieties that mimic those coveted feathered and flamed patterns through careful, scientific hybridization, not through chance infection. And here's a quirky tidbit. There are still enthusiasts and specialist growers who cultivate historic tulip varieties, sometimes even direct descendants of bulbs from the 17th century, or those that emulate the look of the famous broken tulips. These are treasured by collectors for their lineage, their unique beauty, and their connection to that fascinating historical period. But now, thankfully, they are appreciated with horticultural passion rather than ruinous financial speculation. Historians still argue whether the intense, almost obsessive focus on tulip breeding during the mania, despite its disastrous economic outcome, might have inadvertently laid some groundwork, a kind of trial by fire, that contributed to a deeper, more lasting horticultural expertise and innovation in the Netherlands, ultimately benefiting the country in the long run. Modern tulip breeders, you might imagine, probably have a framed print of a Semper Augustus on their laboratory wall, with a little sticky note underneath, saying, "Inspiration." But let's aim for stunningly beautiful and commercially viable, not financially apocalyptic, shall we? And so, the tulip finds its serene and lasting place in modern Dutch domesticity. You see them heralding spring in window boxes in bustling Amsterdam, lining the paths of tidy suburban gardens and bursting with color in public parks. They are given as gifts, celebrated in festivals, and remain a source of national pride. Today, if your gracious Dutch host presents you with a bouquet of tulips, you can be quite certain it's a genuine gesture of warmth and hospitality, not a subtle attempt to offload a speculative asset or a down payment on their canal house, which, frankly, makes for a much more relaxing and enjoyable visit for everyone involved. The tulip, once an object of such wild and untamed desire, has settled into a comfortable, cherished role, its charm enduring, its beauty a constant. Far removed from the brief, bewildering madness it once unwittingly inspired, it's a quiet triumph, a testament to the flower's inherent appeal and the Dutch people's ability to learn, adapt, and ultimately to cultivate beauty in a balanced and enduring way. And so, you've journeyed with us through the intoxicating rise and dizzying fall of Tulipomania, witnessing a nation's passionate embrace of a simple flower, an embrace that led to fortunes imagined, made, and tragically lost. We've seen the tulip, in its quiet dignity, endure beyond the madness, reclaiming its place as a cherished symbol of beauty and Dutch identity. As our story draws to a close, let's just gently rest here for a moment and ponder some of the timeless reflections we might find nestled within those delicate, colorful petals. What can this nearly 400-year-old tale of floral frenzy truly tell us as we drift off to sleep tonight? At its heart, the story of Tulipomania is a profoundly human one. The desires that fueled it, the longing for beauty, the dream of quick riches, the thrill of the gamble, the infectious nature of crowd enthusiasm. These are not unique to 17th century Holland. You see echoes of these same financial dreams, that same speculative spirit, that same windhandel mentality playing out across centuries, across cultures, with different commodities, different assets, be it South, Sea stock, railway shares, dot-com companies, or even, dare I say, particularly enigmatic digital kittens or pixelated primates in more recent memory. It seems humanity's collective financial memory can sometimes be as fleeting as a tulip's bloom. We see something new and shiny, something that promises extraordinary returns with seemingly little effort, and all the old, hard-won lessons about caution and intrinsic value can just wilt away under the heat of the moment. The mainstream historical fact is that economic historians and behavioral psychologists continue to study Tulipomania as a classic, almost archetypal example of a speculative bubble, using its patterns to try and understand the recurring and often predictable ways markets and human beings behave under the influence of speculative fever. The tale also invites us to reflect on the nature of value itself. What is something truly worth? Is it the cost of its production, its utility, its rarity, its beauty? Or is value simply what someone else is willing to pay for it today, in this fleeting moment? Tulipomania strips bare the often vast gulf between intrinsic value and market price, especially when that price is driven by collective desire and the belief in an ever-ascending spiral. The beauty of a Semper Augustus was real, undeniably breathtaking. But was it worth a townhouse? The ephemeral nature of the flower itself, blooming for a short season, its bulb susceptible to disease and decay, stands in stark, poignant contrast to the equally ephemeral, but far more destructive, nature of the speculative bubble it ignited. Perhaps there's a gentle wisdom there, a reminder to appreciate beauty for its own sake, without always needing to translate it into guilders and stuvers. A quirky tidbit is that even amidst the ruins of the crash, and in the years that followed, Some dedicated, perhaps wonderfully stubborn, individuals continued to collect and cultivate tulips, not for profit, but purely for their love of the flowers, diversity, and charm. These were the true horticulturalists, the genuine plant parents of their day, carefully preserving rare lines and appreciating the artistry of nature. Long after the speculators had moved on to chase other fleeting phantoms. As you look back on this whole extraordinary episode, you might find yourself wondering about the what-ifs and the deeper currents. Historians still argue whether Tulipomania was a unique, almost freakish, product of its specific time and place. The newly prosperous and confident Dutch Republic, with its burgeoning merchant class, its innovative financial tools, however informal, and its particular cultural fascinations, or if it's a more universal human script that simply found an exceptionally flamboyant and well-documented stage in 17th century Holland. Did anyone truly learn a lasting lesson? You have to wonder if, for many years afterwards, any time a Dutch husband came home with a particularly enthusiastic story about a revolutionary new investment opportunity, his wise wife might have just quietly reached for the nearest tulip bulb, handed it to him, and then pointed towards a mirror, letting him draw his own conclusions. The moral of our sleepy story tonight: perhaps it's simply to admire the flowers in your garden or in a vase on your table for the simple joy they bring, rather than checking their theoretical resale value on some imaginary exchange. Or at least, if you are going to dabble in markets, maybe diversify your portfolio beyond petals. A few sensible, unexciting herrings, as it were, probably never led anyone too far astray. And now, as our journey through the vibrant fields and smoky taverns of Tulipomania gently concludes, allow the echoes of this curious story to become a soft lullaby. The frantic bidding has long since faded, the desperate calculations have ceased, and the once priceless bulbs rest quietly in the earth, just as you, hopefully, are resting quietly in your bed. Imagine the Dutch night, centuries ago, the canals. Reflect in the moonlight, the gabled houses holding countless stories, countless dreams, some fulfilled, some broken, all part of the rich human experience. The tulips themselves, unaware of the turmoil they caused, would have continued their cycle, unfurling their beauty with serene indifference each spring. Let that image of quiet resilience, of beauty persisting beyond chaos, soothe your mind. There are no more contracts to scrutinize, no more market prices to anxiously check, only the gentle unfolding of history. A story told to help you ease into a peaceful, untroubled sleep. The past, with all its fascinating follies and enduring wisdom, can be a comforting companion as darkness falls. Allow yourself to drift, to float, carried on the soft currents of this tale, towards a night of deep and restorative rest.